second expedition to the Primordial Forest. The arrival. On the 9th of April, 2005, I made my second expedition to the Primordial Forest. My youngest son Luke accompanied me on this excursion to see what the area was like. Dan and his wife Dee had left for the area on Friday, the day before us. We got a late start and arrived at the area around 9 a.m. the next day. When we arrived at the base camp, we found no one there. Dan and Dee were in the area and were soon to arrive back at the base camp. It was a pleasant surprise to see that Dan and Dee had set up our tents before our arrival. It was a nice camp with 2 extra tents set up for my 2 sons and a larger one for my wife and me. Unfortunately, my wife and oldest son could not make this trip. There was a nice fire pit with a pot for coffee set to the side, and tiki lights placed in strategic points around camp to provide us light after sundown. Not long after we had arrived, Dan and Dee returned from the research area. They both looked tired considering it was a long trip into the area. Dan was excited to tell me about what he had found. He told me they had found many new tree breaks and gates along the slough to the northeast and west of the research platform. We sat around and chatted for a while and soon loaded my equipment into the boat and headed back to the area.
New evidence. Things had changed since my last trip to the area. The vegetation was more abundant, which made it easier to identify food sources. I was impressed with the amount of dewberries and grapes available along the banks of the river. There was an incredible amount of vegetative food sources here. My son was enjoying the boat ride along the river. You could see beavers and snakes swimming along the banks. Long-nosed gar lay close to the top of the water, waiting for bait fish to swim by. The boat would scare them and make them splash out of the water as we went by. The smell of honeysuckle permeated the air. It grew in abundance along the river's edge, making the air smell very sweet. No wonder the Bigfoot use it to make their nest out of. We wound our way down the river heading towards our destination. Dan knows the river like the back of his hand. He knows where every hidden stump is, and you can be certain you are close to one when you hear the engine slow down, and we make a sudden turn to the left and then to the right. We finally made it to our stopping point on the river. We pulled to shore, put on our packs, and headed in. We hiked down the trail towards the research outpost, looking for any new evidence that might be close to the trail. We made it to the outpost and checked for signs around the feeders. There was still feed in them and no sign except for the older tracks of wild boar. This could be a good sign. Dan feels the Bigfoot may be keeping them out of the area or hunting them. I have yet to see any small fur-bearing animals except for beaver and nutrias. There should be many squirrels and swamp rabbits, but I have yet to see either one of them. The bird population is doing well. Many species are in the area, except nearby the research outpost and Snake Hill. I have yet to see one of the ivory-billed woodpeckers, but have heard them foraging for food. Dan wanted to show me the new evidence he and Dee had found. We headed west across the makeshift bridge Dan had built over the slough. We made a right towards an area with heavy cover. We went into the thick cover and then came out next to a smaller slough. On the opposite side of the slough was a classic tree twist. The tree was a small hickory sapling approximately 15 feet tall. It had been twisted over approximately 4 feet above ground level. I have seen this same twist many times before. When a trail comes to a slough or small creek, these animals will break a smaller tree over for some reason. There was another twist, break on the other side of the creek. This tree was a black willow. It was twisted over at the same height. I looked for evidence of tree decay or disease in both trees and found none. I also considered possible flooding of the creek and the trees being damaged by a larger tree ramming them and twisting them. While there was a rapid current, there was no evidence of this. I ruled out lightning strikes also. We then turned west and headed towards another area further into the woods. We came to a small sugarberry tree that had been broken over. The interesting thing about it was that each tree we had seen was all broken over in the same direction, towards the southeast. I found an interesting correlation between these trees and the trees I found while researching on a 20-acre tract of land in Delta County. Each tree broken over there faced the southeast also. If one were to look back towards the other broken trees, you can see a heavily traveled trail. After seeing these trees, we moved further west into really heavy cover. The undergrowth became too thick and we had to turn around. I did not bring my machete with me, so going further was not an option. We headed back towards the outpost and stopped for a rest. During our conversation at the outpost, Dan asked me if I wanted to set up in the area that night. He said it was strictly up to me. He understood I had only been in the area one time before and was not familiar with the area. I had brought all of my baiting equipment with me, but was not very anxious to set up on this trip. I was not prepared. My recording equipment was not working properly, and I was unarmed. Another holdback was my son. I was not comfortable with him being there while baiting these animals. I was hesitant to say yes, but after much thought, I figured the best way to determine whether these animals were still in the area was to set up. I knew if they were still in the area, they would come to the bait. Dan needed to be introduced properly to these animals, and this was the best way to do it. It was a go. We headed back to the boat and made for base camp preparations. After returning to base camp, we sat down and decided to come up with a plan for that night over lunch. I had an idea of what I was going to do as far as bait placement, but no idea of what I was going to do for possible vocalization recording. My micro recorder was on the blink and worked half of the time. I would use it anyway in hopes of it working. Dan had 2 video cameras, so maybe we could use them to record. I was ill-prepared for this first-time attempt and knew it. I had been in this same situation before and missed recording some of the best vocalizations I had ever heard because of faulty equipment. I started preparing the bait. I did not have all of the bait I normally use, but had a few of the ingredients. I only hoped it would work. Most of the time I used dry fish-flavored cat food, black plums, cantaloupe, deer scent, honey, and berries. I was without most of the ingredients, so I hoped what I had would work. I used wild dewberries picked last year and frozen for future research, honey, and deer scent. I opened the bag of frozen berries, dumped them into a bowl, and mixed about 1 cup of honey with them. I mixed them until a lot of juice had been made. I dumped the mixture into a gallon jug and capped it. The deer scent was only to be used in the field after the cameras were in place, and everyone involved was in place. Loud introduction. By the time we were settled in it, was approximately 8:20 p.m. I took out my small micro recorder and set it on the arm of my chair while Dan adjusted his camera. We were facing the northeast and had a southeast wind. The honey had not started to burn yet, but you could hear it begin to boil. Finally, the honey began to burn, and you could see which way the wind was blowing by following the smoke from the honey. The only light in the camp was the blue glow from the sterno can under the honey. Thus far, there has been no action. I could hear whippoorwills calling to one another, and an occasional barred owl calling in the distance. We sat there for quite some time, and then from the east, we heard what I thought was a barred owl making a single-tone call. It was approximately 9:30 p.m. I turned my micro recorder on to record these sounds. For some reason, this call did not sound like a barred owl. I am not one to associate barred owl calls with Bigfoot vocalizations, but in this case, there was a different sound to this call. These calls lasted about 5 minutes or so, then it got quiet again. We were all straining to hear any unusual sounds that may have been related to Bigfoot, but nothing as of yet. It was a very dark night, and you could barely see anything. The forest canopy blocked most of the starlight, only allowing a few shimmering stars to be seen through the treetops if the wind would blow. The smoke from honey floated ever so slowly into the deepest part of the forest. In a way, I was mesmerized by it. It was very peaceful, so to speak. What I didn't know was this peaceful illusion was about to be shattered, and I was to be thrown back into the harsh reality of Bigfoot research. At approximately 10 p.m., Dan pointed out that something was moving behind him, which would have been to the northwest of our location. I have a problem hearing certain sounds, so I did not hear it. Not 5 minutes later, I started hearing something heavy moving behind me towards the southwest. A large branch snapped under the weight of whatever it was moving around us. It was not a hog, because it would have grunted and raised a big commotion, and a deer would not have gotten that close. Around 10:10 p.m., we smelled a strong musky smell. It was an animal smell. It was not boar, but a strong odor like sweat and rotten sneakers. Whatever was circling us was trying to be as quiet as possible. The only sounds we heard were the branches breaking, but that was enough to give it away. The tension began to build. I could hear my son's breathing becoming shorter considering he was sitting behind me, and Dee was becoming restless in her chair. The nylon material would make a zipping sound every time she moved. Dan was looking from left to right, trying to see what it was, but to no avail. At one point, Dan asked me if he should turn on his spotlight, and I said, "No, it might make whatever it is mad, and whatever you do, do not turn it on." It suddenly became very quiet. No frogs or other wildlife were making a sound. It was too quiet. I knew one was close, but didn't know how close. I turned my recorder back on, in hopes of catching something on tape. As we sat there waiting, we were caught totally off guard by what happened next. From behind us to the northwest, the loudest roar I had ever heard in all my years of research come from the densest part of the forest. I jumped to my feet, kicked the honey off of the baker's rack, snuffed out the sterno, and wheeled around facing the direction of the roar. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel the adrenaline rush through my veins. My son moved towards me, and Dee was saying, oh crap, what the hell was that?" I told her it was a Bigfoot, a big one. At this point in time, my mind was racing, trying to determine at what level of aggression this roar was at. I told Dee and Luke to get into the research stand. It did not offer much protection, but it was better than nothing. Before they reached the top of the ladder, I decided the roar was from a big male and decided it was not best for us to stay in the area. I had no weapon, and my son was with me. This animal was very angry we were in the area. I told everyone we needed to get out of the area fast. We grabbed the cameras, tape recorder, and backpacks and headed out. We only heard the one roar, but it wasn't over yet. We took off down the trail going as fast as we could, flashlights pointing in every direction, making sure it did not rush out at us. Dan took point and I took the rear. As we were heading out, Luke said he heard something to our left. It was moving through the dense undergrowth, snapping over small saplings paralleling us as we walked down the trail. Dan heard it, then we all heard it. One of my worst fears happened as we were heading down the trail. I stepped into a hole and twisted my ankle. I felt the bone pop and down I went. My ankle was weak anyway, because of a break that happened when I was a child. Dan stopped and walked back to help me up. I was nervous from having this Bigfoot roar at us and shadow us out anyway, but now add the pain of a twisted ankle on top of that. My hands started shaking at this point. My hands always shake when I get a major adrenaline rush from being so close to them. Even in such a stressful situation, I guess my pride was still intact, even though my ankle wasn't. I got up and continued making my way out, making sure to hold the spotlight ahead of us as much as possible and behind us. We made it back to the boat without seeing it. I suppose it knew we were leaving and decided to not take a chance on getting shot. It had the perfect opportunity to charge when I fell, but it didn't. We all got in the boat, tossing what gear we brought out with us into a jumbled mess. Dan got the boat turned around, and we started making our way out. Dee wanted Dan to start up the gasoline engine, but I told her no, we needed to use the trolling motor. In case it tried to come to the edge of the river, we could hear it. I sat down on the floor of the boat in the front so Dan could see in front of him. Dee hooked up the spotlight to the battery and shined it ahead of us. I scanned the riverbanks for any sign with my spotlight for movement, but there was nothing. The river was very eerie that night. You could see small columns of fog twirling up from the water. Now and then, you would see a snake swim in front of the boat. With the combination of the incredible roar, adrenaline, and the eerie fog, it would be the perfect setting for another encounter. I was expecting the creature to rush out to the edge of the river at any time. I guess you can say I was disappointed in a way, not getting a glimpse of the creature that made this tremendous roar. There was not much talking on the boat ride back to base camp. I think everyone was still in awe at the events that had transpired earlier that night. We arrived back at camp around midnight, built a fire, and then the reality of what happened set in. I used Dan's cell phone to call my wife. When she answered, I told her, there was a flipping T-Rex in the woods down here. I explained to her what happened, and she seemed to be excited for us. I hung up, and we all sat around the fire, talking about what had happened.